Very good afternoon, everyone. With profound happiness, I am introducing our introductory speaker, Dr. Ashfaq Hassan, a leading pulmonologist and academician with 3 decades of clinical expert experience in respiratory disorder management. Professor Dr. Hassan is currently working as Principal, Professor and Head Department of Respiratory Medicine, Deccan College of Medical Sciences, Hyderabad, India, a premier medical institution in Telangana region with the combined institutional bed strength of over 1500. Professor Dr. Ashfaq did his medical degree MBBS from Gandhi Medical College in the year 1986 and did his Doctor of Medicine in TB and Chest from the State Medical Institute, that is Usmania Medical College, Hyderabad, India in the year 1992. Dr. Ashfaq is the Chief Editor of Journal of Medical and Allied Sciences and former editorial board member of the journal Chest India, and is associated with several boards as member and fellow, to name are European Respiratory Society, Indian Chest Society, Indian Sleep Society, Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine. A leading pulmonologist of India, he was awarded with recognition by Indian Medical Association and has delivered over 300 invited lecture sessions nationally and internationally and has more than 70 publications with over 250 citations. As an active teacher, he has written several books which are published by leading publishers such as Springer Verlag UK and are ranked as high as number 3 and 4 books on pulmonary medicine and intensive care in Amazon's bestsellers list worldwide. His books have been translated into Polish and Russian languages. He has shared chapters, books on several subjects including respiratory, metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, mechanical ventilation, blood gases, etc. Sir has conducted several training programs on usage of inhalation devices, respiratory improvement in asthma and COPD patients. His work on use of pneumococcal vaccine in mass gatherings with special reference to Hajj pilgrims is widely acknowledged by Journal of Global Infectious Diseases. His articles, Bronchiectasis in India, results from the European Multi-Center Bronchiectasis Audit and Research Collaboration, EMBARC, and Respiratory Research Network of India Registry, published in the Lancet Global Health. Ventricular tachycardia tuberculous lymphadenopathy, sign of myocardial tuberculosis, published in Journal of American College of Cardiology. His works and findings on active pulmonary TB and TB control in India are worth to be mentioned here. He also serves as member of Board of Trustees at Shakti Shifa, a privately funded non-denominational organization for the primary and community healthcare of underprivileged women and children, and also serves at SANS, an initiative for underprivileged individuals with lung disease. With this august introduction of this luminary, the son of soil, I now call upon Professor Dr. Ashfaq Hassan to deliver the introductory talk on guidelines in respiratory medicine, challenges in interpretation and implementation.
Thank you, Dr. Fareed. Thank you very much, Dr. Aziz Sahab. And I think Dr. Fareed's introduction has exceeded the time frame of my talk by some length. But at the same time, I hope you are able to see my slides. So it's a massive privilege for me to be on this forum, and let me start because I think we have if you can confirm that my slides are moving, then I will take it forward. So let me start off by saying that I don't call my own students as students. I call them as either doctors in training or as specialists in training based on whether they are undergraduates or postgraduates. And I feel that this applies to every single member of a professional course. So you are a professional in training if you're a student in pharmacy. And that's the reason I'm going to take you straight off the deep end, and I'm going to take you into the complexities of pulmonary medicine. And I'll try as best as I can to make things simple, to clinical aspects simple, though I'm sure you understand pharmacology much more than I do. So guidelines basically are, I mean, it's a no-brainer. They are, as I said, I'm going to take you off the deep end right now, and I'm going to take you directly into the complexities of pulmonary medicine. And guidelines, as I said, they are basically documents which are prepared with the aim of guiding decisions regarding diagnosis, management, treatment in specific areas of healthcare. And they have been in use not for the last few years, but literally for thousands of years. And earlier on, they were based on tradition and authority. But modern guidelines, it is necessary to appreciate, are based on evidence. So that is extremely important for us to understand and practice and take forward. And these include summarized consensus statements. But what happens in clinical medicine is, although that we as clinicians are obliged to understand and know all the guidelines that are available to us on our dedicated subjects, the clinical practitioner sometimes has to decide whether to follow those recommendations or not. In very, very exceptional circumstances, he or she may choose to deviate from them depending on the situation. And that brings us to, the fact that many of these guidelines are not really perfect at this stage, because medicine itself is not really perfect. And the domains that we as respiratory physicians practice in, they're very much varied. For example, if you compare to a cardiologist practice or gastroenterologist practice, we practice in areas as diverse as infectious disease, in sleep medicine, which is a completely different kettle of fish, in critical care, mechanical ventilation, urology, interventional bronchology, and it's a kind of a multi-directional. So it's no surprise that disparate organizations have furnished their various guidelines, and there are very many of those. So this is what was the situation about 30 years ago, and we had guidelines which were few and far between. But of late, there has been a kind of a snowballing and an avalanche of these. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see that the two most important guidelines that we are conversant with, they are practically renewed they are literally renewed every single year. And because medicine itself has got such a great pace of evolution, and not all guidelines are well accepted. There are some which have changed the course of medicine or changed the practice, but I will focus for the best part of my talk on one or maximum two of these guidelines in order to take you more into the depths and the intricacies of what lie below. So let me start off by explaining to you the fundamental difference between COPD and asthma, because we are going to talk mostly about asthma today and touch upon COPD just in passing. Asthma is basically a disease which involves an inflammation of the airways, and that inflammation is eosinophilic, which means to say it is steroid responsive. And that really offers us an opportunity to modify the course of the disease, because once you eliminate the inflammation from the lung, then you are actually putting the patient on par with a person who is basically healthy. You're actually targeting health to the person. But in COPD, it's a different matter. The inflammation is mostly neutrophilic. We don't have drugs to treat neutrophilic inflammation adequately at this point of time, which means to say that there is very little you can do, and most of our direction of our treatment is focused on symptom control. So in COPD, you're trying to make the patient feel better. In asthma, you are trying to make the patient healthy. And that is an extremely important thing to realize. But of late, there have been some changes in COPD treatments, and we are also envisaging in the very near future some form of treatment modification in terms of therapy. So this is what we have woven for ourselves, and we have practiced to deceive ourselves by deluding ourselves into thinking that asthma and COPD are one disease each. They are in fact a set of different conglomerate conditions which are now considered to be grouped under the heads of COPD, asthma, etc. So this is, in the words of Maria, the best place to start. It's a good place. We'll start at the very beginning. It's a very good place to start. And the very beginning itself, we have some troubles. Because if you talk about asthma, if you look on the left, it doesn't matter if you don't want to read that, but it looks to you like a description. It doesn't sound like a definition to you. And why is that? It's because we have not understood asthma. When you don't understand a particular disease, you kind of tend to describe it, and that kind of glosses over really what is the real aspect of the disease. But if you would like to break down the definition of asthma in not so many words, there are only 3 points that we need to understand. One is there is airways obstruction, which is reversible. And the reversibility is achieved, if you look on the right side of your screen, by means of a bronchodilator. So reversible airways obstruction is determined by spirometry, and you can see the images at the bottom. The one on the left represents asthma, the line in green represents the pre-bronchodilator effort, and the one on red represents the post-bronchodilator effort. And you can see that there is a significant separation between these two lines, which means to say that the obstruction has been made to reverse by use of a bronchodilator, and that kind of defines asthma. Whereas on the right, you can see that there is not much reversibility. COPD is an obstructive airway disease. That much is seen on the graphic on the right side, but you cannot see a separation between those two lines. In other words, the airway obstruction is not reversible. So the first criterion for defining asthma is that it is a reversible airways obstruction. The second thing, of course, is that the airways are very twitchy. They can be made to contract by subminimal stimuli, which normally don't affect healthy persons. And that's the reason we try to irritate the lungs by a dose of, let us say, methacholine, which normally should not irritate a healthy person's lung. And then if you have a contraction, then you determine that these airways are hyperreactive. And the third, of course, is inflammation. And inflammation is defined as the response of any vascularized tissue to injury. And in asthma, unfortunately, although we know a great deal about what's happening in terms of inflammation, we don't have as yet any practical means to measure inflammation on a day-to-day basis. So this is COPD, and again, don't bother to read about the whole thing. It is sufficient if we understand that COPD is a progressive disease. It's an inflammation of the airways which does not respond to conventionally available medications. And because it doesn't respond, you rather you concentrate on what you can achieve, and that is bronchodilation by use of bronchodilators. So bronchodilators are important in asthma, bronchodilators are important in COPD, but because some very, very major benefits. This is like about the differences between all the same in the early manifests. Early persons are smoking, trying to the manifests a little late. Other manifestations of allergy are present in asthma, like allergic rhinitis, dermatitis, conjunctivitis. There is a bit of periodicity in which the symptoms go up and down, unlike in COPD, where they are actually relentlessly progressive. There is a history of smoking almost invariably in COPD, although in India, and of course, asthma can be offset by, it can be set off by allergens, whereas that's not the case in COPD. So this is what the COPD definition of phenotypes were. We won't be going too much into that. Why can't I change my slides? But this actually is important, because this is when it all started. And when I was a medical student, textbooks frequently defined obstructive diseases as a combination of the reason that asthmatic emphysema, and that made sense because asthma, as I said, is eosinophilic inflammation. It has a different path compared to COPD. Now, asthma actually, in some way, what happened was, you know this, you can see the Brandenburg Gate in the background, and you can see the famous Berlin Wall in the foreground. And you know that on November the 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall was taken down, and that unified two sets of Germans who were separated in terms of time physically, but they were genetically identical. So there was an opportunity to study these people in terms of different diseases, and we made tremendous progress in the understanding of asthma based on the early papers from Germany. But the unification of asthma and COPD also occurred in 2017. You can see that the tricycle was turned into a bicycle because we understood that the inflammation and the disease pathways of both these diseases were different. But then the guidelines, in their inestimable wisdom, they decided to unify these diseases once again in a syndrome which was called the ACOS, the ACOS, the Asthma COPD Overlap Syndrome. And the letter S at the end is very important, as I will go into a little later, because this was a kind of a syndrome which occurred in younger people who smoked, and these people manifested COPD-like traits. They had allergies like allergic rhinitis, bronchial hyperreactivity, etc. But they also had incompletely reversible obstruction of airway like COPD. And particularly if these were undertreated and in advanced stages, these people, they proved to be indistinguishable from smokers. So this was the differentiation between the two. And eventually the thing boiled down to the fact that because there was a combination of asthma and COPD, asthma brought with it a treatable inflammatory component, which all along we were controlling well with the steroids, and therefore the steroids were applied to this particular subset as well. So this accustomed to this term, and eventually what happened was, surprise, surprise, in 2020, the guidelines, after 1 year of deliberation, they removed the S from ACOS and made it ACO, ACO. Now many pulmonologists, we found it a source of considerable mirth that after 1 year, all that happened in these guidelines, the gold guidelines, was that the S was removed and the ACO was kept. But if you look at it, it has tremendous significance. What you're really talking about is that when you're talking about ACOS, the asthma COPD overlap syndrome, we are talking about two diseases that are fundamentally linked at some basic level and having common roots. But when you take away the syndrome S, then you are talking about asthma and COPD, which are practically occurring coincidentally if they should occur in the same patient. So this had tremendous connotations, and eventually this term is also probably on the way out because the guidelines have kind of clarified a lot of things, but in some ways they have proved to be inadequate. But the other thing that we have learned is that COPD, as I said, it's not a homogeneous disease. The most important examples of that are the chronic bronchitis and the emphysema, because both the patients look different, they present differently. But asthma itself, the thing that we imagined was a unique eosinophilic inflammatory disease, itself turned out to have different kinds of inflammation. So this was in consonance with the new language of medicine. We had new phenotypes of asthma emerging. Those phenotypes were linked to something at the base, which are called endotypes, which were determining the phenotypes. And of course, this implication of all that was that people being different, there was great room for something called personalized medicine. Now, this gentleman was basically responsible for the one gene, one enzyme hypothesis. And what it meant was that there is for every single trait that is present in a living organism, there is one gene that is responsible for that. But once the human genome was finally sequenced, we found that there were far fewer active sites than had been expected before its sequencing. So now we know that the genes that are available are not enough to account for the disparity that is available in terms of respiratory diseases, the kind of manifestations and the phenotypes that we see. But what is probably happening is the genes are acting interactively, and once that happens, you can have n number of permutations, combinations, and the possibilities for phenotypes. And then came this man who was basically the youngest graduate of Harvard, graduated at the age of 15. And that was an age at the turn of the century where we had the conventional asthma wisdom that was emerging. We had the advent of epinephrine. We had the steroids that were coming in. And he was one man who said that asthma is not one disease. It is a set of different diseases. And he actually gave an example of two of them. He and his assistant Mallory in the seminal paper said that asthma can be intrinsic, which is to say it can be a kind of a persistent chronic disease which doesn't respond to the kind of treatments that we normally were available at that time. And there is something called an extrinsic asthma, which is caused by triggers and allergens, etc. But in all our conventional, in all our infinite wisdom, we kind of put it on the back burner. And in 1927 to 2008, we kind of forgot all about the work of Rackerman and Mallory. And this was until Pranab Haldar and Ian Pavord, they came up with this particular graphic. And then they said that there are different types of asthma. There are symptoms and there is inflammation. And in many cases, the inflammation may be in concordance with the symptoms, but on the other hand, inflammation may be disproportionate to the symptoms, or the symptoms may be disproportionate to the inflammation. And as you can see, they set down several of their phenotypes that they found. So this is quite unsurprising if you look at it, because people are predictably different. And if you're talking about guidelines, guidelines are prepared for the good of the common many. What you're trying to do is trying to make a few baskets or your few categories of persons or diseases in which you set separate treatment, so that that helps uniformize the care. Treatment at the other end of the world should not be treatment different from the treatment that I'm administering to the patient today, because I am seeing a patient in a limited number of subsets. But the fact of the matter is, behind the mask, we are all different. And if you are talking about guidelines, guidelines don't make for personalized medicine. So this is the chart that the GINA guidelines give us. As I said, the most important guideline for asthma for all pulmonologists. And these steps have remained the same, but the components have changed in consonance with the changes that have been occurring in medicine. So today we understand that asthma is not one disease. There are several phenotypes. There are clinical phenotypes which are related to the people who exacerbate frequently, who have severe exacerbations. The patterns of airflow, they are more in the proximal airways or in the smaller airways, whether they have comorbidities like obesity, whether the inflammation itself, what we considered as eosinophilic, is no longer so. It could be eosinophilic, it could be neutrophilic, it could be paucigranulocytic, it could be a mixed inflammation, or there could be a number. If you can look at the last part, the number 3, there are phenotypes which are responsive to specific medications. And this is actually, at the bottom, you can see a figure of a tree. And just imagine, if you just snip off a little bit of that tree and you expand the image, that image of that small snip will take the picture of the larger whole. And this is called a fractal. So you can magnify that, and it can, it emerges as the same as the original picture. It's also, what it means is, in nature, the law, nature doesn't behave in integers. There are fractions which keep on repeating themselves, and that's a science which was proposed by Benoit Mandelbrot, but we are not going to touch upon that. But what happens is, the lung is the most elegant example of a fractal in nature. This endows the lung with 2 very, very major advantages. One, it optimizes the conditions for lung growth. It optimizes conditions for lung ventilation. But it brings with it a tremendous disadvantage. And that is that if some problem begins in some corner of the lung, it can amplify very, very rapidly to the rest of the lung in processes which are called avalanches. And the meaning of the word avalanches. So it's almost as if there is a supercooled beaker of ice that is waiting to crystallize, that is waiting for the seed crystal or a sharp tap. And then when that happens in the form of a stimulus to the lung, it can immediately bronchoconstrict. And as you can see, the image of the bronchi have virtually disappeared in a matter of seconds or minutes. So we are still coming to terms with this new knowledge, and certainly the guidelines have not given us much insight in this matter, but we are beginning to recognize that severe asthma itself is a separate disease possibly. And this has to be addressed on its own terms. And if you can look at certain of the papers, they have also found that the inflammation in severe asthma actually is more in the smaller airways. It's more in the outer surfaces of the smaller airways, which means to say that we and all treatments in the future might need to pay attention to the kind of inhalers and the kind of dry powder or the kind of meter dose inhalers which will target these small airways with extra fine particles. And extra fine particles are indeed already, the advent has been made in asthma, and they will shortly be coming up for COPD as well. And there are other groups of patients with special problems. And we, for ourselves, we had realized very, very long ago that people who are obese, you can see that on the second bubble on the left side, they tended to be female, they tended to have a lot of symptoms, and they tended not to respond to the treatments that we had. And that was not surprising, because again, this paper from even Pavard and Pranab Haldar, that showed that the inflammatory component in these individuals was relatively low. And therefore, the drugs that we had to address the inflammation, like steroids, would really not work well in these particular patients. So, and also, post tissue in the lungs, in the bronchi of these people as well. So that's just to give you a couple of examples of how complex things are really beginning to become for the pulmonologists. And it's now beginning to become easy to understand why the whole thing is beginning to become an extremely complex area, because there is an inflammation, you're calling it asthmatic eosinophilic inflammation, but there is a neutrophilic component that's intruding into that. You have a condition called COPD, which is basically neutrophilic, but you have eosinophilic component intruding into that. And you have, again, a different subsets within that as well. So this is the definition of asthma. And again, as I said, there's not much of inflammation there. But if you have something called a non-eosinophilic asthma, that virtually takes your inhalational steroid or your systemic steroid out of the equation, because these guys, they don't respond with those kind of treatments. And unlike eosinophilic asthma, where peripheral eosinophils correlate with eosinophilic airway disease, in non-eosinophilic asthma, peripheral neutrophils don't correlate with neutrophilic airway inflammation. And obviously, there are no currently drugs to treat neutrophilic asthma. And so it's a kind of a major challenge as far as we are concerned. But biological therapy is emerging in a big way for all diseases, not asthma itself, but for many diseases. But if you talk about asthma itself, every step of the pathway offers us opportunities to intervene at some point and try to reverse these things. And again, these are the recommendations from the GINA. We have now got the anti-IgE drugs. For a few years, omalizumab is there. Then we have got the IL-5 drugs, which are the mepolizumab and the reslizumab. And then we have the IL-5, which is the benralizumab, and of course IL-4R, and kind of they may or may not kind of become relevant in the future. We don't know. So the thing is that we are now beginning to talk about diseases in terms of inflammations, in terms of the background problems, and you talk about non-atopic asthma, in which you're talking about mepolizumab and then omalizumab. You're talking about atopic asthma, where omalizumab is very firmly entrenched. You're talking about atopic asthma with eosinophilia, where again both of these drugs become a possibility. And then you talk about a Th2, that is a non-eosinophilic kind of asthma, where you don't really have any options, and you have to think about some mechanical options like a bronchial thermoplasty, where you kind of use heat waves to actually make incisions into the bronchial tree, that is bronchoscopically as a day care procedure, or use some other methods like a macrolides. So these are the complexities that the guidelines are kind of presenting to us. You are constrained to seeking direct evidence for Th2 disease, which means to say eosinophilic disease, and we need to implicate non-Th2 disease by ruling out Th2 disease, because you don't have any handles on the non-Th2 disease. So these are some of the biomarkers that we were looking at. Some of them have gone away, but again, the rationale is not very clear, because if you talk about so many mediators, so many pathways, then logically you would say, or you would probably intuitively understand, that the earlier in the pathway you intervene, then the greater would be the benefit, because more of those chemicals would be controlled by acting at an earlier stage. And that is the reason that these guidelines have not yet settled. There is still a lot of controversy between what biological is still important. Some people say that it is still more worthwhile to intervene at a later stage because the drugs are more effective. well, some people don't agree. So, I mean, the guidelines obviously are not to blame, but this is what's exactly happening in the field today. And also, we don't yet understand what is the best way to assess a particular patient for a particular biological agent. The best way would be to determine whether the patient had a eosinophilic inflammation in the lung, but that's easier said than done. The most elegant way that you could determine it is by understanding how many eosinophils are present in the sputum itself, but that is again not easy to do because it needs a decontamination process by dithioerythriol. It needs to be filtered to a homogeneous suspension of cells, and then you need to do a total count and a viability, which is to be determined in a hemocytometer, and then you have to do cytospins. And these are beyond the reach of many labs, especially in the developing countries. And there are indirect ways, which we call as the fractional excretion of nitric oxide, which makes us understand whether this person is having an eosinophilic inflammation in the lung and thereby is a candidate for steroid therapy, inhalation steroid therapy. So this test itself has got its advantages and disadvantages. There are factors that falsely increase the fractional excretion of nitric oxide level, factors that falsely decrease the phenol levels. And of course, then we have to fall back on what is available with us, and what is available with us has been available actually not for the last few years, but for the last 100 years or so. Because on the left, you can see is the picture of Henry Hyde Salter, the man who gave asthma its name. But this was the man who gave patients a powdered adrenal extract. And what did the adrenal extract contain? It contained an extract of the adrenal medulla, which contained a chemical similar to epinephrine, an extract of adrenal cortex, which contained a corticosteroid. And if you look on the right, that's exactly what we are giving today in terms of inhalers. You're giving a combination of a long-acting beta agonist, and if you're giving and a steroid together, which we call as the LABA-ICS combination, and which is one of the cornerstones of asthma therapy today. So we have relievers, which are salbutamol alone, preventers or rather controllers, which are the steroids, and the most efficacious way of delivering both is to deliver them together, because that way you are focusing both on the bronchodilation and you're focusing both on the inflammation. There has been a significant change in the last year or so, because in the most lightest of asthma steps, we used, if the person was not symptomatic, very, very occasionally symptomatic, all we used to do was to give them a salbutamol inhaler, take it on an SOS basis whenever you feel the symptoms. But when meta-analyses occurred and some studies actually went into they found that these people were returning with very, very severe attacks later. So today, it is now recommended that if you give a beta agonist as a rescue therapy, you should also club it with some kind of inhalational corticosteroid therapy as well. So those are the relatively new recommendations. And of course, it's a no-brainer that if you have, these are actually very, very elegant studies by Professor Bateman from South Africa. And what he showed was if there was a lurking inflammation in the lung, which was either partially controlled or uncontrolled, then it could very, very easily lead to an exacerbation by lowering the threshold. And these people, their outcomes would be bad, not only in the short term, but definitely in the long term as well. And it was a major challenge. It is a major challenge to keep asthma quiet. And inhaled corticosteroids are the cornerstone of treatment, and there is no doubt about that, because there were some very, very elegant studies by Suisa et al. Who showed that the number of canisters of steroids consumed were directly proportional to the state of the health, to the lessening of mortality, the lessening of morbidity, the increased longevity, and those things have been established beyond all dispute. However, there is less agreement about what constitutes an equivalent dose of the steroid, and there are some very, very rough and ready reckoners for that. But notwithstanding that, whenever you have stabilized a person on a particular dose of steroid, the obligation is to move him or her to a lesser dose of steroid in order to minimize the risks. So asthma control actually is very different from asthma severity. It is individualized to a patient. For this person's lungs or set of lungs, what is the best possible control, and that today is our most important target. And we try to step up the therapy when the asthma control is not optimal, and then we step down the therapy once the control has been achieved after maybe about 3 months of obtaining good control, and then bring the patient down to the lowest possible medication that is optimum for him or her. But something else has emerged in the meantime, because sometimes if you look at any pulmonologist practice, it is beyond the comprehension of many patients to tackle so many things. I mean, not all are doctors. So you can put yourself in the patient's position, and it sometimes is overwhelming. So in order to kind of simplify the uh, things for the patient, we hit upon something else. The guidelines actually took a long time in bringing this approach in, and even then they mentioned them in passing, and this is called the SMART approach. The S stands for single inhaler for the maintenance, M and rescue therapy. So that is the acronym, SMART approach. And the idea of the SMART approach is to intervene when the patient is beginning to have an exacerbation. It means to say when the inflammation has not evolved or snowballed to a large extent. And that's the time when you increase the dose of the steroid, inhaled steroid, and you put in a bronchodilator as well. This might actually, if used for 4 or 5 days, as the attack is beginning to build up, it might actually avert the attack. And this really has seemed to work, because in the SMART therapy, you normally use only one inhaler, and that is a LAVA long-acting beta agonist and a steroid combination. It really doesn't matter what steroid you use. As I said, there are issues about equivalence. There are some controversies whether fluticasone causes more side effects compared to, for example, budesonide, etc. But be that as it may, what is crucially important in the SMART therapy is the molecule formoterol, because you know that there are other molecules like, for example, salmeterol, which is an equally good long-acting beta agonist, but formoterol is the short act. It acts very, very quickly. Salmeterol, the action starts much later and is probably sustained for probably as long or little longer than formoterol itself. But formoterol has its nose ahead because it acts very quickly, and that makes it pretty much the ideal candidate for SMART therapy. So these are these little sticks of dynamite, which always look to me, those are the 7 domains, of course, which you will recognize of the beta receptor, and they are anchored in what are called as lipid rafts, which hold the receptor together, hold the drug molecule together, so that the molecule can act properly. And some of these molecules are lipid soluble, which means that they're retained there for a longer period of time, and some of them are lipid insoluble, which are maybe aqueous, soluble in the aqueous phase, like salbutamol, which acts fast and gets out fast. So formoterol is kind of in between. It's not as lipid soluble as salmeterol. It's not as aqueous soluble as salbutamol. So here it has the advantages of acting fast, remaining a little while longer. So the challenges to the SMART approach are that it is actually really an art, because if you are not able to avert that exacerbation of asthma, you should very, very quickly change your plan and go to a systemic steroid in terms of an oral or whatever else. But you can't persist with that once the patient is not showing a response to that. So technically, that SMART approach applies for very, very limited people. And here is, of course, the steroid. As I said, any steroid will do. There are some technical differences between all these steroids. But again, one of the criticisms of the guidelines has been that we as pulmonologists have not understood enough what are equivalent doses of certain steroids. And maybe we are using molecules such as fluticasone in far higher doses than probably would be required. And finally, coming to probably the most important aspect, which impedes proper asthmatic outcomes, is the lack of adherence, the lack of communication, because it's extremely difficult for a person to coordinate, a person to understand, and of course our own curse of knowledge, that we believe that the patient is understanding in our science, our explanation, etc., whereas the patient may actually be completely at a loss. So even if you prescribe inhalers, let's say twice a day, a LAVA-IGCS combination, it might be too much for a particular patient. So you had molecules like chromoglycate, which was an excellent molecule. It was extremely safe, much safer than probably anything else that in practice of pulmonary medicine, but it had to be taken 4 to 6 times a day. And of course, once the advent of the steroids came in, for example, budesonide has a triple linkage, the acetyl linkage. So it's metabolized, the first pass metabolizing through the liver, as you know, it gets cleaved, and it's a very, very safe drug. So in a very small fraction of dose, budesonide was more effective than cromoglycate, and eventually beclomethasone and budesonide kind of replaced cromoglycate in adult practice of asthma. Anyhow, these are twice a day is still a lot for many patients, and once the patient is completely stabilized, twice a day is still the way to go, although once a day has kind of been grudgingly acknowledged by the GINA guidelines, but tomorrow it may change. So I think Farid mentioned that this is in passing. This was one of our, we were part of this particular publication very, very recently in the Lancet. I can't take the credit for the bronchiectatic paper that was done by my colleague here, but this is one paper that we really kind of worked with, and maybe this may be the basis for future change in the GINA guidelines over the next couple of days. But having said that, any step down in asthma therapy should be considered a therapeutic trial, and with all antennae up for any escalation of symptoms, etc. So I need to change my slides. So I think I will kind of skip this here, because I'm sure Aziz Saab doesn't want me to go on further. It's already this thing. So I'll conclude by saying that this is who we are. This is, we are, and COVID has actually shown us it's a great equalizer, and you know, we are all just as vulnerable as everybody else. But behind the mask, we are different, and we need therapies which are actually different. But although this talk basically has been about the challenges around guidelines, and it's a formidable topic given by Professor Aziz, but I've really taken you off the deep end, and I hope you have, you know, been with me throughout. But be it a criticism of the guidelines, let us not forget that this is the best available evidence is still packaged in the guidelines today. We cannot dispute that. And occasionally guidelines may not work, but clinicians, whenever they are deviating from the guidelines, need to stick to the best available evidence to support their action. And tomorrow it will be a different thing. I mean, you'll have metabolomics, you'll have proteomics, you'll have epigenetic genomics, you'll have all this. But today we need to focus on something very, very important. And this is a picture from 1952. This is the Great London Smog. You know that it lasted for 4 days. It killed a minimum of 10,000 people in those 4 days, maybe 25. And this is a picture of Delhi. And this is a picture of my last slide. Where is it? This is a picture of Hyderabad that I myself took. This is the Golconda Fort, at the foot of which lie the magnificent Golconda mines, which gave the world the best of its diamonds, sparkling diamonds. But the Golconda Fort itself is obscured in a smog in 2021. So I thank you very much for your patience, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.